Good afternoon to all our students, faculty, and esteemed guests from the Berggruen Institute. Today's symposium is called Futuring, and it emerges from the collaboration between SCI-Arc and the Berggruen Institute, marking a convergence of two institutions that are devoted to education, ideas, technology, art, philosophy, and policy. And both institutes embody the transformative power of ideas whose time has arrived. The Berggruen Institute is a nonprofit, non-partisan think tank in Los Angeles, founded by Nicholas Berggruen in 2010. And it aims to tackle global issues, promote cross-cultural understanding, which is why we're all here today, and shape the future of our planet. And at the heart of the institution mission, there is the future humans, today our guest. And this project explores how emerging technologies like AI, biotechnology, genetic engineering will influence human existence and our future. The symposium also capitalizes on SCI-Arc's innovative approach to architectural education, and also the Berggruen Institute dedication to fostering interdisciplinary dialogue, which is what we're going to have today. Today's event supports also educational initiatives aimed to equip students like yourself and the future generation that will lead design with the skills needed to address global challenges through creative design thinking and cross-cultural awareness. Today, the unspoken question will be, what does it entail to design for a not-so-distant future, and what defines our humanity in that context? The speaker of honor today will be Dr. Claire Isabel Webb. She is the Associate Director of Future Humans at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles. Claire directs the Institute Future Humans and investigates the histories and futures of life, mind, and outer space. She earned her PhD from MIT, HASTS program in 2020, and her book project, Reflexive Alienation, explores how scientists since the space age, despite alien forms life, perpetual, and perhaps permanent unknowability, have designed sophisticated experiments of extraction that anticipate our biologies and intelligences. And from the side of SCI-Arc, we'll hear from our design faculty, Zeina Koreitem. She is a founding partner with John May of Millions, a Los Angeles-based design practice. Most recently, Koreitem and May were named by Wallpaper as one of the US 400, which is a great honor, I think. It was very nice to see that. The people shaping America's creative landscape in 2024. Damjan Jovanovic, co-founder of the Los Angeles-based game design studio Lifeforms. He is a SCI-Arc faculty with whom actually I've been teaching for a few years, and I've been firsthand an admirer of his work and his strong conviction and technical skills and design abilities. He is an artist and a designer working at the intersection of video games, artificial intelligence, and architecture. Rehm, designer based in Los Angeles, whose work focuses on the integration of machine learning, intelligence agency, and platform software for design and cultural production. In addition to his office, MMR, also he's a coordinator of the EDGE program, MS, in architectural design technology at SCI-Arc. And finally, Jackie Bloom. She is the graduate thesis coordinator and also faculty at SCI-Arc. She has been doing a fantastic job in the past few years organizing these events for all of you, students and faculty. She leads her own practice, JHB Studio, that embraces the integration of art, technology, and nature to inform the making of buildings, interiors, objects, and landscape. And she will make us the honor to moderate the discussion. So welcome all our guests to the podium. And we'll start with our guest of honor.
Thank you so much, Elena, for that warm welcome. This is a really exciting beginning of a longer collaboration, I hope. Okay, so I'm going to talk about technologies of perception and how we perceive the world and how that constitutes new senses of self and new ways to relate within nature. Go back. Okay. They challenge the cultural values of authenticity in art making. They pollute the aura. They blur the boundary of what is considered natural and what is considered artificial, what is God-given and what is made. Did you think I was talking about AIs? So Sora, Midjourney, and DALL-E, among other AIs, are more than human tools that indeed can embody the description I just gave. They are the latest technologies that we have evolved to represent natural objects, the more than human world, and our place within vast networks of life. But much older technologies fit that description as well. Consider 16th century astronomer Galileo Galilei's revelations that moons orbited Jupiter. This destabilized the Earth as the center of the universe. Consider the digesting duck that Jacques de Vaucanson debuted in 1764 to falsely demonstrate the artificialization of biological digestion. And finally, consider Louis Daguerre's daguerreotype, which presaged the text-to-image and text-to-film technologies evolving today. The assemblages of techniques, instruments, and machines that have progressively disclosed the complex materialities of our world and beyond are technologies of perception because they transform how we see ourselves. We use them to spur new natures, and we discover new ways to be human in concert. And we have been doing so since prehistoric people first made art 35,000 years ago. So I'm going to talk about visual technologies and how they illuminate the following domains of knowledge making: the virtual, the simulated, the artificial, and the synthetic. So although we often think of these domains as being of this moment, from gaming in VR to dating an AI girlfriend to xenobots that are biological robots made in a lab, these categories are historical. And my hope is that you come away from this talk understanding the historical context and the lineage of these technologies as you look toward the future. Okay, so let's revisit Galileo's telescope. So Galileo is thought to have attended La Accademia del Disegno in Renaissance Florence, an institution that wove together mathematical principles of perspective with artistic techniques of the hand. In this period of intense creativity, artists in training learned to see the world in a new way. Galileo's scientific observations cannot be disentangled from his artistic practice and the influences of his fellow artists. Galileo turned his spyglass to the heavens. He engineered the telescope's two lenses that together magnified a distant image and made it appear right side up. This technique produced a virtual object in which lenses directed the light through reflection and refraction to appear to meet at a point, but they never actually converge onto a physical space. So unlike a device like the camera obscura or pinhole camera, which produces real images, you cannot put these on a screen. There's nowhere for the light rays to go. So what did he find? So he found what a contemporary called the strange spottedness of the moon. So in his treatise, Starry Messenger, Galileo observed that the moon's surface was not smooth, uniform, nor precisely spherical, but rather uneven, rough, and full of cavities and prominences, being not unlike the surface of Earth. Galileo's moon, an imperfect body rife with craggy geologies, pockmarked by ancient collisions, related familiar terrestrial features to unfamiliar lunar ones. This required a symbolic reordering of the cosmos. Because the Catholic Church's moon, upon which the Virgin Mary reigned, referenced the Immaculate Conception, Galileo's depiction called into question the very concept of the moon and the heavens and God's universe as perfect and pure. Galileo had corrupted Dante's eternal pearl, and the new moon's representation came to enter religious frescoes, a tacit, if wary, acceptance of a morphing world order. And I love this page. You are all probably familiar with the technique of chiaroscuro and playing with light and shadow. And it was a whole new way to see the heavens. I love it. Okay, so now let's zoom forward to today and explore a different resonance of the virtual. Okay. So virtual reality is a tool to explore what's called homuncular flexibility, the embodied effects of manipulating the brain's spatial perception of that body. Humans easily inhabit a whole manner of various virtual avatars in surprising ways. It doesn't take long to embody other creatures with similar corporealities. The enactment of arm and hand movements easily maps into a virtual lobster's claws. What's more, with a little bit more effort, we can map into even more alien bodies. Once we've learned the rules of the virtual world, we can figure out how to inhabit an octopus's 8 tentacles by producing subtler movements such as rotating our wrists, flexing our ankles, etc. So, a strange combination of virtual features. So for instance, a third arm sprouting out of one's chest, a tail extending from one's back. Researchers are exploring homuncular flexibility for medical benefits. So they ask burn victims to throw snowballs in virtual environments, and this decreases chronic pain. There's new research now that by making the virtual avatar really distinct from one's physical body, that this disembodiment can lead to positive cognitive responses to trauma through the disattachment. So when we reemerge from virtual worlds, its ghosts briefly haunt us. They can make us behave temporarily that we carry virtual features into the real world. Shedding the embodied feeling of having a tail takes a little bit of time. And I'd love to hear if you all have experienced this too. But is a virtual world less real than a physical one? Did Galileo's virtual moon only appear? By eschewing materiality, are experiences in virtual worlds paler than, or even false versions of, ones in the real world? Of course not. Virtual objects in virtual worlds engender richer experiences of what it means to be human. They offer up new ways to see. After all, its Latin root virtualis means virtue and truth. Okay, now let's look at simulations. Okay, so you're all probably familiar with this. So I want you to imagine tens of thousands of years ago, you enter a cave with your kin. You brandish a torch and figures come to life. In the flickering firelight, discrete images entwine. They become animated. Overlapping animals seem to jostle each other. You witness the chaotic collective motion of a herd of gigantic animals thundering across an ancient plain. So these were thought to be humans' first movies. Fire was the technology humans used to tell stories about their lives tens of thousands of years ago. These stories reflexively help us today tell a story about ourselves. So I visited the Cougnac caves in southwestern France just a month ago, and it was so magical. I really encourage you to go see these caves. They contain some of the earliest known human art and a frieze that functions like the film I just showed you. So how prehistoric artists paced and placed their drawings seems to pull the viewer into a narrative. They cleared some of the calcite stalactites to make way for panels to draw on, but they also worked with existing rock formations to highlight certain figures, like the ibex that appears to have hair flowing from its belly. So moving from left to right, the viewer beholds a magnificent frieze that depicts 3 overlapping giant deer, mammoths, and ibex. So here's a detail. In this, if you see the figure of a man, there are 3 spears, we think, going into him. The wounded man is one of the very few prehistoric representations of a human. And what's fascinating about this is that the 2 lines that would go up to his neck and his face are left ambiguous. Humans only started drawing faces 15,000 years ago. So what happened in 20,000 years for them to evolve a kind of consciousness that made them want to represent faces? It's a mystery. So here you can see how they used the rock to accentuate the representations of drawings. These are thought to be, the figure on the right are aviforms, so bird forms. And you can see that the one on the left, they're all these right angles, and people don't really know what they mean, but you can see how they resonate with the rock face. Okay, and then 10,000 years later, humans in the Cougnac cave started making these kinds of marks, these dots. So it's again a mystery. Why this evolution towards abstraction and representation, from animal figures to human faces to perhaps is this like a painter's mark? We don't know. Is it a signal that one is part of a particular tribe? We don't know. So I asked our guide in the Cougnac cave to kill the lights. So there are all these like artificial lights that he turned on and off throughout our journey, and they're LED bulbs so that the light doesn't damage the caves. And it was complete blackness. And it struck me that I had requested that we simulate the original conditions of the cave that our long-lost peoples, as our long-lost people, ancestors, had first encountered it. I felt time folding in on itself. The cave became pregnant with human consciousness. So this is an image from the replica of the Lascaux caves. People are not allowed in it anymore because there were too much damage. And the French spent almost $1 billion building an exact replica. And what I mean by exact replica, they used prehistoric materials, ochre and magnesium and charcoal, prehistoric tools, and they have such intimate knowledge, the archaeologists do, of each line, of each painting, of each little formation, that they can recognize even like when something is a little bit off. So I visited this right after Cougnac, and the faces of the walls and their intricate geologies, one knows that they're made of concrete. There is a cave bear skull that's made out of resin. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but this example of a physical simulation of the real thing actually diminishes the primary work. The replica evacuates the aura. Okay. So this is a different kind of physical simulation. So I observed combat simulations that were held at Fort Irwin, a national training center for the US Army in the Mojave Desert. So what was really weird is how authentic the experience was at times and how that mask slipped a lot. And it was very jarring to kind of move between those experiential spaces. So 15 villages there are exact replicas of one in Afghanistan. Army recruits spend 21 days in the desert. They flush out the rebels from the caves there, and they have to eat these like really weird lunches, and you like rub it together to create heat and steam. But basically, you get a really lukewarm mystery meat, I thought. There were no vegetarian or vegan options. So they really committed to the authenticity. But the simulation Veritas was bumpy and uneven. So here I'm showing you the marketplace. And as you go through, perhaps you can see, okay, so this guy has some fruit. The fruits are all plastic. They had enormous slabs of meat, also all plastic. And you could see where the paint on the plastic had been rubbed away with time. I tried to barter with, I didn't really know what was going on. And so I tried to like give one of these marketplace people, a vendor, $1, and he was speaking, I think Persian, and he said, he went into English and said, no, like these are not for sale. So the experience like only got weirder. So now I'm gonna show you from the observation deck, the actual simulation of the battle. But but before you watch it, I just want to tell you that like as we were walking up, these village people transformed into like, I don't know, townspeople who were like witnessing the battle to come. And as they were kind of waiting, we were waiting for the helicopter, we were waiting for like things to get in place. They started doing like TikTok dances and like practicing together. And so the whole thing was super weird. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this.
Assassin 6, Assassin 1-6, Hellfire mission complete. BDA 4 enemy combatants, PIA, over. The aircraft has engaged the insurgents with a Hellfire missile, causing the insurgents to cease firing and retreat. At this point in time, the U.S. forces will call up to their higher headquarters to request a medevac to evacuate the individual. This process is called a 9-line, which is a series of radio transmissions describing the situation, such as the number of casualties, condition of the casualties, medevac pickup site, and the hostile threat. Assassin 6, Assassin 1-6, Hellfire mission complete. BDA 4 enemy combatants, PIA, over. The aircraft has engaged the insurgents with a Hellfire missile, causing the insurgents to cease firing and retreat. At this point in time, the U.S. forces will call up to their higher headquarters to request a medevac to evacuate the individual. This process is called a 9-line, which is a series of radio transmissions describing the situation, such as the number of casualties, condition of the casualties, medevac pickup site, and the hostile threat.
All right, so you saw the helicopter coming in. So these troops are play acting at finding out that a rebel has an IED and they found his house, and you can hear the actors like screaming in the background to increase the authenticity of our experience. What was so weird, we found this out later during their debrief. So the helicopter that came in to medevac an injured soldier, the person who played the soldier actually had his leg blown off in Afghanistan. And now, for his day job, he plays into that simulation. Okay, and then perhaps the strangest moment in which these like layers of reality collided in a really weird way was that after the dust had literally cleared, I looked over the rooftops and I saw a crow that was observing the scene too. And I experienced a very brief but very potent moment of confusion Was the crow part of the simulations? And then a colleague immediately teased me, are birds real? So for the trainees, the simulated battle was a complex and experiential technology of visual and embodied perception meant to prepare them for combat that they could soon face. For me, the battle was a reminder of how simulations are platforms to play at different ways of being human. So I'm going to leave you with this question. So we've gone through historical and contemporary examples of both simulations and virtual worlds. So thinking about how you're going to make things in the future, how will you invent new technologies of visual perception to disclose richer topographies of reality? Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I don't think you can see. Okay. So, well, first, thank you, Jackie and Elena, for organizing, for including me in this event. So the talk is divided in 3 chapters today. I will talk about image, the noise, and opticality. The beginning of the lecture touches on ideas that my partner and I have been working on the last couple years, and which have been published in various formats. Some of these ideas have culminated into more proto-experimental work. And the first chapter will touch upon more directly on the topic that Jackie has asked me to discuss with you all today. And then the lecture will end with a snapshot of some of our built work and our recent interest in optical space. So we'll begin with image. Since the 1400s, architecture has defined itself as a problem of design and whose primary representational medium was the act of drawing, combining the activities of art, math, and geometry, and then creating its own mode like the plans, section, and elevation for the imagination of objects. For a very long time, architecture or architectural surfaces were orthographic, meaning that just like writing, they were governed by rule-bound systems of geometric marks produced and manipulated by the movements of hand mechanical tools. The step-by-step routine of orthographic projection, the gestures of the hand, the pencil, the T-square, the Z-square, are different than the simulation process that allows us to model, say, a platonic solid in most basic softwares. A lot has been said about images, historically, aesthetically, politically. Art historian W.J.T. Mitchell here speculates in 1984 about the picture theory and attempts to redefine images in 5 categories. Ultimately, Mitchell tells us to take images seriously is the realization that spectatorship is as important as reading, and that images are not subservient to text. At the time, a radical realization. But the idea that an image can be defined technically is a radically new thing. For decades, the disciplines of art and architecture history used to focus on the content of images, describing what they are, rather than on their technical structure. And in the more recent history of computers in architecture, say in the 90s, talking about the technical aspect was almost frowned upon. If we were to define images technically, we might say they are electrons, charges, signals. You could say they are measurable, they are data, they're mathematical. In the book Signal Image Architecture, we see a pathographic manifesto, a philosophical diagnosis of architecture's technical consciousness before and after what John May calls electronic images. And I quote, "Architecture today is immersed in an immense cultural experiment called imaging. We can feel our images changing us, our relationship to our thoughts, to our sense of time, to the cadence of our attentiveness. All of this is now subject to rapid revision. To patiently describe the world to oneself is to prepare the ground for politics that do not yet exist." So May traces the difference between images and drawings, particularly in the context of our discipline, architecture, and he asks what happens to the architectural mind when it stops pretending that images of drawings are drawings. Images are databases, they're mathematical rather than geometric objects. They move across media and get projected on screens. Images are also different from photographs, and ultimately drawings, photographs, and images are incompatible formats. Ultimately, what May is interested in is describing a world that is post-text, post-line. In Peter Gallison's words, it's a shift from representation to presentation, and perhaps we're already there. We must find avenues of establishing meaningful analysis with imaging itself and in the context of our own discipline, not so much with respect to the content of images, but rather with respect to the processes. Perhaps the central paradox of our contemporary consciousness is that as imaging becomes perhaps the primary way in which people give their lives meaning, the specific content of each image has become less meaningful. How many of you, for example, have checked in with your phones at least once since I began this short lecture? And how many of you are looking at your phones now that I mentioned it? So May tells us that today we live telematically, and architecture is inseparable from the culture in which it is immersed in. It's a philosophical endeavor. Not only have images produced a strange relationship to history, in fact, it eliminated it completely, but it also is actively producing frightening politics, especially in a world of information saturation. Noise. So the culture of images is one of saturation and noise. It's also a culture from which effects proliferate. In a project initiated in April 2003 called the Telematic Channel of the US Department of Art and Technology, the art collective Zakros proposed an ambitious remixing and deconstruction of publicly broadcasted video material in an attempt to reclaim control over mass media for politically active artists. The question of error here became intentionally and unavoidably political. Sounds familiar? Since the beginning of our practice, we've studied and experimented with something that we've called somewhat vaguely computer graphics. We mean a number of visual effects that are increasingly permeating architecture today, and which of course already dominate many other visual cultures and art practices. But computer graphics is actually a very messy term. It's used differently in different fields. It's more stable in more scientific fields. But in the visual arts, it sort of has to be studied through different lenses. As a subfield, we can all agree that it is commonly defined as pictures or films created using computers, but this description hardly begins to give an account of its many histories. In a way, it's not possible to study all its dimensions, but instead, as a way of addressing the somewhat blurry nature of it, we can focus on, at least I've focused, on the structure and technical histories, let's say, of stills and moving images. So I return to the origins. Before images were standardized in our ubiquitous softwares. In the early days of video production, a small group of artists and engineers tested the possibilities of manipulating the signal of a television. Some of the first video synthesizer experiments tested the physical vulnerability of the cathode ray tube TV, and the interference through patterning and modulation created these shapes, these unexpected distortions, visual effects, color effects. And color on the screen became material and more than a superficial gimmick. Colorization became really fascinating because precisely it was so mysterious. And in this short film poem field, one of a series developed by the experimental filmmaker Stan Venderbeek in collaboration with Ken Knowlton at the Bell Labs, these short films were produced by layering geometries, text and sound, and the majority of which were generated by the computer, but then they were outputted on a 35mm black and white film, and color was not programmed, but rather added physically. So computational images do not exist without the notion of color and vice versa, and exploring the vast territory of colorization requires learning and becoming literate in these fields of color effects. So in our work, this has meant recognizing that so many of these processes are imported, and we have to kind of be amateurs again and kind of learn about the processes of intervening in these visualizations. Notions of accuracy, efficiency, precision, predictability, control, and workflow or optimizations have to be rethought, and instead, perhaps other qualities that are normally minimized, like uncertainties, inaccuracies, noise, become the field of discovery and experimentation. So some of the early studies were about asking what really goes into the making of images, but also what composes them, and how do they influence our process as architects. And so if we were not to work with plans and sections, what does it mean to extract content here? And what does it mean to place these in relation to three-dimensional objects? And then what does it mean to merge them with numerical material processes? The process can be recursive and repetitive. Sorry, I don't think it's playing. Okay. I'll end with this last chapter. In a series of recent projects in our office, we've tried to explore and experiment with something that we've called optical space. Because these projects are mostly interiors and often involve the adaptation of previous programs into new uses, materiality is liberated from the burdens of weathering and thermal enclosure, freeing it to expand into other domains of experience. The ways in which materiality is closer to, let's say, visual effects and scenography. Optical spaces dream of becoming images, not because they won't be inhabited or because they're dismissive of architecture, but simply because that dream brings them closer to contemporary culture. When architecture confronts a condition in which socialized electronic images from the substrate of public life, opticality emerges as a set of techniques for realigning space, geometry, and materiality. That process of realignment is never one of simplification. It denies from the outset the common assumption that images are flat or superficial, and asserts instead that the contemporary electronic image is in fact almost unimaginably thick, dense with information. This tremendous thickness is governed by a series of concepts that, while not totally foreign to our discipline, to architecture, they are typically seen as secondary to form or program. So brightness, saturation, contrast, hue, reflection, refraction, diffusion, highlights, etc. A deep catalog of concepts now readily found in any image software. Opticality presses those very concepts to the foreground, and in doing so begins to establish parallels and affinities between architecture's traditional concerns and those of parallel fields, like scenography, for example, and in which whole material assemblies are arranged to produce imagery. Our goal has not really been to reduce architecture to this definition, but rather to pry open our own process by asking how these seemingly peripheral image desires, for example, for hypersaturation or for layered reflection or for muted contrasts, all of which we now associate with the general notion of filtering, for example. We've wanted to ask how these desires might participate in or contribute to more typical architectural concerns. So the question for us became, how do we instrumentalize this notion of opticality that emerges through image making? Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. And I'll be talking about this project called Planet Garden, which is a video game simulation modeling the role that AI may play in supporting the recovery of planetary ecosystems. And this is a project that basically is like 5 years in development. It's going to be, it's part of SCI-Arc's view of Planet City. It's a group exhibition exploring radical re-envisioning of a sustainable planetary future. And it's based on lead curator Liam Young's transmedia project called Planet City that explores implications of Edward O. Wilson's half-Earth proposal to remove at least 50% of our planet's land and marine areas from human use and set them aside for preservation of, and regeneration of biodiversity. But the work is really something that is going to be part of the Getty Foundation's PST-Art project in September. So I invite everyone to come to the opening. But what is interesting about it is that it's something I was working on for 5 years already with my game design studio, Lifeforms.io, and I'll be showing like a sneak peek of that today. So a foundational idea for the project is that any thinking about the future of humanity must take an issue of energy and resources into account. So this also means that this requires a political system that supports human flourishing on a planetary scale. So I'm not interested in human survival, I'm interested in flourishing. I think this idea is fundamental to any thinking about future, right? And I'm interested in the positive outcomes. I'm interested in the possibility of having what they call a good Anthropocene. So I'm against any notion of degrowth and any kind of degrowth ideology that might emerge, and I think it's something that is becoming prevalent in academic and art circles these days. So this project is very much like trying to kind of reinforce this idea of basically of abundance, right? So in the case of Planet Garden, the story explores implications of AGI singularity with an environmentalist bend. What if we moved all extractivist technologies off-world? What if we built swarms of solar satellites in order to capture limitless free energy and create a world of post-scarcity and abundance? Is good Anthropocene possible? How does Earth after singularity look like? So we explore this idea of AI planetary stewardship in this project. So in my version, all of this becomes contaminated through systems thinking that harks back to cybernetics, but also heavily becomes influenced by the Deleuzian notions of ecology that operate on multiple scales, especially the idea of the assemblage. So Planet Garden combines these two ideas, the pursuit of AGI singularity and post-scarcity politics, with a rediscovery of systems and Gaia environmentalism. So this is done through the medium of simulation or video game. Through the years, I have done a lot of research and writing on games and simulations and how they transcend the idea of fiction because they're models. I'm interested in a new idea of models. And they're interactive and testable models of a world. So this specific design practice of combining simulation with AI is something I call worldmaking. So worldmaking is a design paradigm employing video games and game technologies and artificial intelligence to explore new ways of modeling and perception. So it moves the conversation about design from objects to worlds. It also takes us away from ideas of composition and compositing, which I would call, on the one hand, Cartesian geometry or mere kind of making of linear media, into projects as immersive world models that operate through systems. So world making takes us into the technical regime of the simulation. And this is something that it could be a full kind of lecture on its own, as many other components. So I'll be showing a few kind of excerpts from the video game itself. But it's important to note that, as Claire was saying, simulations have a history, and this idea of maybe a kind of a simulation as a real enacted act. In my case, I'm talking about the simulation as a technical kind of format in a way, right? So we use Unreal Engine as the main tool, which is a game engine. What is really interesting about it is that it produces this idea of or actually it introduces the idea of a possibility of modeling a fully scaled kind of world. And in this case also, it kind of problematizes one of the main questions that are present in today's discourse about the Anthropocene, which, as TJ Demos would say, the expanded spatial and temporal scales of geology exceed human comprehension and thus present major challenges to representational systems. Well, quite simply, it's hard to visualize the world, right? It's hard to understand the scales of the world. It's hard to kind of grasp the complexity of the world. And I think the combinations of these technologies kind of enable us to have a much more tangible experience. So it's partially an experience, and it's partially something where we can learn about the world. So the game itself has multiple components that I will go through, but one of the main components is the exploration of the world and kind of understanding the multiple scales and the multiple, let's say, components or systems that operate. At the center of it is something that we call the Gaia Large World Model. And this has a double meaning in the project. One is that Gaia is the main character, but it's also a massive decentralized networked environmental AI inside the game that kind of produces the world of the game through its backstory and through the narration. The name Gaia obviously comes from James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis's work. Something that was one of the foundational ideas was the insight from Lynn Margulis about evolution, that evolution doesn't have to be understood as an adversarial process, that it can be understood as a process of codependence, of cooperation. So in our case, the Gaia is basically behind the scenes. It's a multimodal AI system consisting of numerous AI agents that function asynchronously. It is a swarm organized by many interconnected and highly collaborative AI agents. And I'll go fast through this because it's it's kind of involved. But what this means is that there are basically numerous kind of agents in the world that collaborate to produce what you can experience and what you can understand. But also, there are agents behind the scenes that actually produce the model behind the model, as we call it, which is part of the experience. I'll go through these diagrams of architecture because it will be very involved to explain all of this right now. But eventually, what is kind of produced is a full stack AI system that can produce text, images, that can read from the synthetic images produced in the game, and also read from player inputs and also voice inputs as well, which is something that we are looking to incorporate. So Gaia's collection of agents are autonomous systems that perceive their environment, make decisions, and pass on the results, allowing groups to achieve complex and multi-step creations using AI. And here you can see an example of basically player interaction that is, in this case, done through basically kind of a chat dialogue where the player can kind of ask questions about the world while basically the model then produces like answers, but also introduces like other questions. So it's all done in real time, and it's kind of all generated. It's not pre-scripted by us. Another component of the game is basically this virtual photography part, which can be used where the player can take like pictures, and it's what they call the photo mode in the video game, right? But in our case, this has the feedback loop into the AI, so that anything that is taken from the game is then fed back into the AI. Kind of AI learns from it. And it's interesting to kind of understand that as part of the world making. I'm always kind of excited to show the scaffold, the digital scaffold of the project, the user interface. I'm kind of into that kind of stuff, you know. Okay. Yeah, and here you can see basically kind of a gallery of taken photos, and this is going to be something that is exhibited as well as part of the exhibition. All of the photos in this, or let's say screenshots in the presentation, were taken from the game system. And then a big part of the game is really the system, or let's say a collection of systems, the model behind the model, as I was telling you before. This is something that is tied to basically the gameplay mechanics and this idea of like how you actually model something in a game world. How do you have an interaction? How do objects communicate between themselves? How do you, establish an economy? And I'm using the word economy on purpose because it has something to do with this idea of ecology as well. They have the same root. And for example, in this case, we are modeling kind of this off-world energy production system, right? And you can see the full kind of system breakdown of how things might actually come and how they might be produced. And abundance of energy, abundance of materials. This is heavily inspired by the work of Gerard K. O'Neill, who was a very important futurist and someone who thought that we will live in space by 2020, But it's really something that, so it's not, what I was trying to tell you is that models are not arbitrary. They transcend, in my understanding, they transcend fictions because they're able to actually produce a testable world. Then we also made this global planetary model, which is, it's very, obviously problematic going back to cybernetics and control systems, which is why we're kind of pairing it with AI and contemporary ideas about generative AI. But, and in this case, and you'll see here, this is the actual system of the forest biome. This was made by one of our students, Ben Elmer, who is also here. And this shows, on the left side, it shows actually the forest system, but on the right side, it shows playthroughs through time and how they converge on different results and what comes out. Really interesting is that you can balance these things out, right? You can actually test them out and balance them out and see how they produce output, right? And once this is paired with player input or agency, as I call it, it becomes this continuum of the player and the game. I'm very interested in that idea that simulations are not something just to look at, but they are mostly something to engage with, right? They're something to kind of play with. So modeling this idea of the player is part of the whole system notion, right? To design a successful game, you have to model the player's mind in some ways. So you have to have an assumptions about the player's mind. I'm very interested in that loop. But in this case, what you can see is basically a production of different kinds of outputs within the forest biome. So it's extremely precisely mapped to the biome that we're using for the game. And as you're exploring the game, you will find these objects that represent, one of them represents a node, and then you can actually get some information or actually get some real-time insight into the system through the game as well. This is something that we are kind of developing. In this case, it's the Arboretum. It's a node of Gaia that doesn't physically represent the actual kind of Arboretum, but it's actually just an access point within the system. So here are some game components, and another thing we are making is a website, So it's part of the same project. But I just want to go through all of this. Oh, sorry, there was also a publication that it will be ready for the exhibition opening in September. Yeah. Another website I want to mention is my research website that I've been developing since 2021 called worldmaking.xyz, where a lot of these things that I'm telling you are kind of were germinated or kind of just planned out. And I was writing a lot about these, trying to connect very, very disparate moments and kind of histories and bodies of knowledge. But I think, to me, you know, going back to Galileo, to this idea that Claire was mentioning, I find that extremely inspiring, this idea that we can rediscover some idea of the Renaissance desire to understand and represent the world through models, and kind of maybe have a holistic, more holistic understanding of the world. So this is my presentation. Thanks, and I want to invite everyone to come to our opening, and I want to shout out to my colleagues who are part of the same presentation, Liam Young, John Cooper, Angelica Lorenzi, and Jennifer Chen. And yeah, thank you, everyone. This was Planet Garden.
Hi, my name is Casey Rehm. This is a bit of a tactical lecture, maybe more so than some I've given in the past, where this was kind of put together on short notice, and Jackie had asked me to look a little bit about how both our office and the program I coordinate here at SCI-Arc works with artificial intelligence within the kind of realm of architecture and building, which I believe is the lecture for this presentation, or my lecture. Within the context of both our office and in the program, we tend to look at three general territories when we're looking at kind of taxonomies of models, simulation types, and intelligence. There's models which we're utilizing for forms of perception, pattern recognition, and trying to gain a more sophisticated understanding of the context in which we operate as architects. And models which we use for generation, for the kind of automation of design production, and problem solving, and then a kind of more ongoing and expanding territory which we're grappling with is this idea of how artificial intelligence and platforms begin to mediate the built environment after we live in it. So I'm going to be going through a few examples and explaining a bit about how we approach it with both within our studio and the program in a kind of sequence here. But it should be understood that these territories are kind of muddy and overlap, and they're always contaminating one another. And in fact, most of them rely on the other three. But it helps us get a framework to understand the specific characteristics and structural biases of each types of intelligence that we work with. This image here is kind of Laura Michelin. I have an office, Michelin, Morandi, and Rehm. Laura dug this up from my very dark hard drive archives in the office. There's a project from a few years back, actually like eight or 9 years back, where we were combining, trying to look at the generating aesthetic effects by combining hardware programming, so governing the flight paths of drones, in combination with what are now some really archaic machine vision algorithms and perceptual intelligences. Looking at how to create images which were both mined and engaging with the world exterior to the simulation or the model that we were working with, but simultaneously, like what the outputs become of privileging other forms of perception and intelligence in the production of design. When we're talking about perception, the abundance and capabilities of classification, object detection, artificial intelligence have kind of rapidly accelerated and is really the kind of primary space for many years of funded research in artificial intelligence. When we look at the kind of generative side of AI, the things that we're kind of more grappling with now, like their progression has been much slower, as historically the space of being able to understand and perceive our world was the one that dominated the kind of funding paradigms, like largely through the military-industrial complex and the need to accurately engage with content at remote distances. But as an example, these are some simple, quick things which any of you guys can download or integrate within user interfaces like Touch Designer, Comfy UI, the kind of need to get into kind of intensive programming to engage these tools has kind of diminished greatly, and the ability to accelerate the training of your own tools has also accelerated. So, we can begin to, the intention is to try to begin to construct alternative understandings of our context, more nuanced understandings of our context that we begin to practice as designers. So, in this case, we're looking at simple things like building height, projection from satellite imagery, segmentation of trees to begin to quantify green space within the city, additional segmentation to begin to break down the surface of the city into its constituents material types, paving, green, building, so forth. Is this an animation? So as an example of this, though, one of the things I think is important to understand about this, though, is that these machines do not understand the image as an image. And that allows us to conflate multiple forms of, is it playing? Yes, just very slowly. Multiple forms of information data in the same space. And to us, this is a very interesting aspect of the types of perceptual AI that we work with, is the ability to conflate data, which is, play faster. Sorry, not a Mac person. Go faster. Simultaneously to detect new patterns. So a lot of the images that I would be showing you here, in this case, are actually things where I've had to reconstitute some data that exists in another space into an image so that it can be perceived by an audience. This is just the city. For example, this is not the actual image that we are working with, but it's a kind of compositing of radiation analysis of the city. So starting to bring in kind of climate information and also begin to hybridize that data with projection, both of the kind of using the machine vision to using the machine vision to conflate both in combination with publicly available tax assessment data to create a new map of the city, which is exposing a gradient of underdevelopment. So looking at how do you conflate kind of parcel information using machine vision algorithms and remote sensing into to approximate the current constructed state within site parcels and conflate them with the kind of tax assessor data as well as the kind of zoning diagrams to create a new understanding of the city of Los Angeles, but purely in relationship to the spaces where there would be an efficiency for creating new housing. Whoa. Well, that's fine. This. And as a kind of generative tool, we use this as inputs to begin to guide for this exhibition that we did last winter, where we're creating kind of using both the tax assessment data as well as the climate data, as well as some soil analysis to project like what Los Angeles would look like if we redensified into those regions of like housing efficiency, also looking at like kind of subdividing city grid in order to create more pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods and to return some of the suitable area within the LA River Basin if we took away the concrete trough into agrarian landscape. I think it's kind of now become second nature and maybe more ubiquitous for understanding analysis as a problem of kind of machine vision, working within that image-based space as architects. But an increasing territory that we're beginning to explore is like how to work with large language models as a way of reformatting and structuring narrative and descriptive text and the things which can be leveraged and utilized by the designer for generative processes. This is an example by one of my students, Manuel Escalante Rascon, who is currently working on developing a pipeline which conflates curated designer mood boards on one hand with an LLM which translates large narrative briefs for things like competition, in this case the 125-page narrative brief for the Helsinki Art and Design Museum competition that is coming up, and to kind of format it in leverageable data for generative AI. So rather than as a designer moving through these kind of deep client briefs, he's built an AI model which can reconstitute it into the significant data, which can then be fed into a generative design process, which leads to generative. And I think it's a kind of murky territory because within our office, all of the generative processes that we work with, again, because we have this preoccupation with working with models and machines which engage data outside of themselves, are driven by machine vision algorithms as their inputs, for example, or other forms of analytic models as their inputs. An example, one of the things that we begin to explore in the office is trying to understand what are the potentials of artificial intelligence to produce compositions and media that we couldn't without it. What are the inherent characteristics? What are the kind of structural biases with which it has? So this ability for us in this series, which we're producing as a series of high-resolution wall coverings for a retail space, this ability to kind of conflate disparate kind of territories from art history of kind of the graphic and the figural in the same space, and simultaneously playing on the fact that artificial intelligence doesn't get bored and it doesn't get tired. So there's a potential here for an infinite scalability of resolution and detail. Simultaneously, this kind of platforms that we've developed, we carry on to multiple projects. They're continuously evolving things. So this is commissioned by a ceramics company in Italy to produce, I should have brought my own laptop, to produce ultra high resolution digital printings for terrazzo and marble alternative surface coverings. As up-and-coming designers, I think one of the things that Jackie wanted me to touch on was the kind of extant reality that you are coming into in terms of the AI that is being utilized to automate the building practice. The top image on the right is the Finch software package, which you can use as a plugin for Grasshopper and Revit, which automate or optimizes, as the software claims, the development of architectural floor plans. Currently used by, beta tested by companies like Herzog and Demeron. And then on the lower right is Delve, which is a master planning AI suite. And it uses evolutionary genetic algorithms as well to automate the production of master planning. And I think what's interesting about these is each of these models, which are going to become more and more ubiquitous in terms of automating our day-to-day practice as architects, all carrying embedded within them a strong idea about what is significant in the design process, what's important. So when we look at something like Delve, Delve in particular is interesting to look at because Google is open about the fact that this is not an architect-facing software. This is a developer-facing software with the intention that a developer would no longer approach an architect to produce a master plan. These don't loop. Doesn't matter. So as a designer, I think it's kind of growing imperative for us as architects if we want to reaffirm or reestablish the significance of what we do, to begin to position ourselves as the designers of the software which will be automating our workflow. So in the background of these is a kind of program simulation, an AI tool, a 3D program AI tool that we're working on in the office and utilizing for a current project, where we are privileging sectional and adjacent-based relationships, as most of the kind of program AI tools that are publicly available primarily privilege repetitive floor plate and planar adjacencies. When we are working with these types of tools, particularly when we're looking more at the architectural side of the production, for us, we view the AI less as like tools for producing image and more as a mechanism for organizing material. This is some examples of an older project on the left, which kind of kicked off a lot of our explorations into 3D GAN-based software 6-7 years ago. And these algorithms, which have kind of continued on to the more recent research and to the robotically assembled CLT panels are, for us as we're developing this process, we're privileging the relationship between the solid and the void within the architectural space. And that consequently leads to a kind of architectural production, which is stripped of figurative elements and figure elements more, and privileging things like planar organization, pattern, and structural performance. This is kind of an extension of that for a solar panel canopy that we designed for an airport in West Africa, which is essentially extending the same platform and models we use for the CLT panels in the house for prefabricated steel solar panel canopy components. I am killing your computer. None of my videos play. All right, so don't crash. I would need to speed up anyways, but this is a bit of dirty laundry, and this is kind of the stuff that you shouldn't show. But one of the things, like I mentioned, the kind of GAN-based automated design tools that we've been working with, which we really love the way it's been creating kind of novel organizational strategies for the material with an architectural project, but are maybe devoid of kind of figurative or figural components of design. We've begun to look at developing additional 3D workflows that are based on clip-guided Gaussian splatting, which is kind of a novel form of 3D representation that began to emerge beginning last fall. So this thing in the background, you can see that also kind of what draws us to this approach is the way the Gaussian splat models work is that they are assembling small little artifacts through opacity, color, orientation, and scale to produce a whole, which dovetails nicely into our kind of preoccupation and obsession with developing architecture through discrete serial tectonic elements. This is just a kind of sequence of improvements and evolutions of the algorithms we've been developing in the office to gain more structural performance from it, as well as kind of more coherent aesthetics. And we're currently, what? Phil, is this your laptop? I won't toss it. We're currently in partnership with a furniture company in Italy looking to produce a viable text to 3D printed chair pipeline, which I'm not even going to hope that this actually runs, but there we go. And one of the things that we're doing is beginning to conflate both the kind of figural possibilities of the text to 3D pipeline with the intention of allowing some amount of user-driven aesthetic transformation while overlaying kind of specific ideas that we have about physical performance and structural performance and aesthetic profile simultaneously with those models. So here's just an example of kind of the most current state of that platform, which is still a bit of ways off before we can get to a viable product. And showing a bit of the range from maybe the one on the right, where our kind of structural performance simulations are governing the growth of the chair more explicitly versus the one on the left, where the kind of the text to 3D component or the figural component of the model is given a little bit more leeway. And the final, good Lord. Play. And the final territory is a kind of a longer running preoccupation of the office, but not one that we've been able to work with much in many projects, although we have an exhibition coming up in the second week of September as part of the PST, where we'll be kind of revisiting some of the concepts here, is looking at how, as designers, we can begin to think about artificial intelligence and these other kinds of synthetic intelligence as active continued participants in the spaces that we inhabit. This was an installation back from 2016. It was my gallery installation, which included kind of 5 interactive media pieces, all driven by what are now some wildly outdated machine vision algorithms. But the idea was that the space itself would be constituted by a perception of and a kind of reconfiguration of the occupant, a kind of space that would be privileging a sort of narcissism of the occupant. This kind of thinking, though, has become much more prevalent, I think, this year within our program. And we're starting to look at many different ways in which we can kind of cohabit the built environment with agential interfaces, agential operating systems, and looking at how that can begin to transform the practice of the architect. This is a research project by Evangelos Koutsiampos, who has built a functioning, I guess, bot on Discord, which can mediate between stakeholders for large-scale development and construction, from tenants, community stakeholders, politicians, and developers. Among the many things that it can do is you can ask it questions to translate legal propositions, state laws, building code into things which can be understood by the layman, as both in terms of like natural language and in terms of creating diagrams that represent those legal consequences. And simultaneously, it's creating like these archives of data that can be mined by both the architect, the developer, and community stakeholders, again, with the idea about trying to create, we've occasionally accused Evangelos of a little bit of a Pollyanna kind of attitude with this, but the idea that it creates an opportunity for more productive community building through kind of transparency and legibility between all the constituent stakeholders within a project. So thank you.
But I thought maybe we could just start because, we're first introduced to Claire, and Claire, you've been introduced to some of the work being produced at SCI-Arc and through the faculty. I wonder if there was just some broader comments that any of you might want to put out there in relation to the work that we've seen today.
Thank you. It strikes me that all of our presentations have something to do with defining limits and how we choose those limits creates an approximation of different kinds of worlds. So, for instance, like it was a really slippery threshold in the Army simulation, at least in my experience. You can make VR experiences slippery by closely relating the virtual avatar to the user's embodied features like skin color and hair and everything. And I just wrote down thresholds, construction of thresholds. So it might not be between the domains of knowledge that I sketched out in the beginning, but I'm curious with you in your practice, how you determine a threshold when you're building a model.
For me?
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think this question of the model is really kind of, it's a central question, but at the same time is a little bit slippery, as you say, because it does introduce the problem of like maybe truthfulness, right? And I think in my case, I'm really interested more in kind of digging deep into the model itself, but not really so much whether or not the model kind of corresponds to some idea of the real. I'm interested in how the model constructs its own real and kind of introduces maybe a new world that, and this idea of kind of worlds is super interesting because of that notion that they don't have to maybe always relate to some kind of idea of the real. And I think that's really a central question for me, like how close can we get to kind of introducing a simulated world that produces effects, that kind of has like self-coherent effects. And that doesn't mean that we need to maybe expose the systems and things to the audience, but it's more about that kind of experience. And I think you were mentioning that there is no difference in a way between the virtual experience of some kind of virtual event and a real, let's say, the kind of that we're in the room right now. And to me, that's like a fascinating history or the fascinating idea that points to history, as you were talking about, like projections and the idea of. I did some research into the history of perspective and how perspective is basically what informs still these technologies that we use and kind of projection. So. And someone was writing, I forgot maybe who it was, but that perspective was one of the first like artificial intelligence technologies because it was able to kind of abstract some idea of vision and then produce like a totally, like a construct, right? And I'm really interested in that because I think that makes us think about design in a different way. Because if we can design the way of seeing, which is in a way what games are really doing beyond just the fact that they're super fun, but like constructing a way of seeing, I think is very important. And that's maybe I don't know if that's the answer to the question. Yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of the kind of title of the symposium, Futuring, and I think, all of your presentations in a really kind of wonderful way helped us to almost forecast ways of seeing and also help kind of shape different approaches to how we sort of manifest our tools in producing ways of seeing. And one thing that I was thinking about was in relation to futuring was this notion of memory and what does memory especially in terms of how we interpret things that we remember or how we interpret images and environments that we see. I wonder if someone can touch on memory and thinking about how do we sort of think about memory as a tool for, or a kind of basis for understanding how we sort of reinterpret things like new images, AI-derived images, and how do we balance, the data with the kind of fidelity of what we're seeing?
Yes, I read somewhere that we have like successfully outsourced memory to the machines, right? We don't need to remember anything anymore, and I think it's an interesting point. What that means for design, I'm kind of curious maybe to learn more about, because it seems like that if you don't need memory, if you don't actually need to have some kind of historical awareness, I guess, where does the design come from? And I think, does it come from the tool or the platform? Like as we know, the kind of the AI systems have certain biases. They're reinforced historically as well through the kind of the procession of these historical technologies that have produced our current technology that we have. So I think there are two things to maybe think about in that way. Like one is the memory of the actual like embedded memory of technology itself, and maybe the other one is like a personal, like poetic memory, like learning things by heart. Like no one does this anymore. There is a great podcast called Weird Studies. I recommend it. The latest episode is about this idea of learning things by heart. Poetry, basically. I don't know. I think it's interesting.
I read yesterday that a couple of philanthropists donated $50 million to the history department at UCLA. No strings attached. And I remember thinking, wow, finally some good news. It's just been such a dark summer or couple months on the news. And maybe this is related to what you're saying, that there's something about the erasure of history and the way that we think about studying history, and it's all interrelated, right? It's not as funded, it's less efficient, so on and so forth. So there is a kind of, I think, perhaps a difficult but real consequence that is happening as we use either images, as we are immersed in images, or as we work with AI generations and other kinds of models, that makes it that we we work very differently and we use precedents and historical references in very different ways, and in some cases we don't at all. And I say this with of course I was excited about it, but there's also a kind of agnostic point here, meaning are we nostalgic to think that that history should be studied and integrated into the way we work, or are we shifting to something different that we should embrace? So it's just an anecdote, because I do think it serves various disciplines in different ways. Yeah.
I kind of disagree with you. I think memory is a human word to describe the accretion of information, that definition is very capacious. So there's planetary memory that's embedded in geological layers. There's embodied memory. I have aversions to particular things that made a bad impression on me that I can't consciously remember, but I know happened to me. And I think that maybe the point is that memory is, for humans, is about this cycle of perception and telling stories to ourselves with technologies and narrative. So I would argue that everything has a memory, but some things don't perform memory.
Yeah, I would kind of fall more along that line, and more about kind of questioning, like, what memory are we talking about? Just kind of thinking through some of this, I started out psych pre-med, specifically monkey psych, which is, dangerous to generalize to humans. But, when we're talking about kind of eyewitness memory, it's like only 40% accurate, right? So the things that we think about as personal memory are a deeply flawed kind of, as a record. And then even I think when we expand that to kind of institutional memory, and the production of history from a disciplinary context, like, often many of our disciplines in the academy are kind of privilege and internal coherence, like often based around the language that's used to describe and record those memories, right? So that in itself has created, in many disciplines, I think archaeology is a good one that's been kind of in a real state of turmoil lately, because of kind of self-reinforcing language producing an idea about one model of the world, which actually, in that particular case, different machine learning models and analyzing artifacts through different lenses have started to expose alternative or new trajectories in understanding the actual history that we got here, but fall outside of that discipline. So on the one hand, there's going to be a kind of shift of what memory we're relying on in the academy, but it's just these different, or not the academy, in the way that we're operating in the world, but it's just different memories in it. And I think all the tools that we're working with are these constant feedback loops between things external themselves, internal themselves. They're building up this constantly also self-correcting memory. Just like we saw, coming up when I first got into GoFei and complex systems stuff back in 2003. So it's been a wild ride. But Amazon was kind of coming up around the same time. They were relying on kind of old kind of models for understanding capital value that came from the Soviet Union. Those were wildly unstable and erratic, and Amazon gained stability by introducing brick and mortar bookstores into their platform, bringing that kind of external feedback loop into that market to create kind of proper valuation of ideas, content, in this case specifically books within it, right? So it's this kind of constantly evolving feedback loop, and we're just kind of adding another element into that ecology.
I think more directly also citing and referencing authorship, all these questions also become at stake. If things are sampled all the time, then references are forgotten and cited. And so that's something that you brought up also in your presentation, what happens to authorship. Perhaps authorship becomes about designing the software itself rather than the work.
Thank you.
Thank you.